What is up, guys? Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. This is another opportunity for you to test the skills that you've learned so far in this course. The title of this challenge is Create Navbar. Fairly self-explanatory. We want to create a navbar using these nav links. You can see them at the top of the web browser: home, shop, forum, cart, my account. And let's just read through the notes. So the objective here is to create a navbar. Cart and my account should be on the far right, while the other nav links should be on the left. So this is the challenge, making home, shop, and forum appear to the far left of the navbar, whereas the other two headings appear to the far right of the navbar. This is a fairly common setup in terms of how navbars go. So you're going to be doing this kind of thing again and again as a CSS developer. However, the challenge here is to do this without using flex or grid. This is the most common way of achieving these types of layouts with a navbar, is to use something like a display property with a value of flex. That's the easiest way to solve this challenge. The challenge here is to not use that option. Besides, we haven't covered this in the course yet anyway. So using knowledge that you already have available to you from what we've looked at during the course, see if you can solve this challenge. This one's a bit more tricky. Don't worry too much if you can't actually find a working solution, but at least give it a try. At least experiment with different CSS stylings to see how close you can get to the solution. And once you've decided that you want to see what the solution is, you can come back and see the solution on this video. All right, so at this stage, it's recommended you pause the video, try and solve the challenge. I'll see you back here shortly. So as we mentioned, the real challenge here is solving this without using flex or grid. That's something that experienced CSS developers might struggle with, because the normal way of solving this is by using a display flex or display grid. So to keep things simple, let's get rid of our paragraph. We don't really need that. So we're just left with the proposed nav links. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to separate these spans inside divs. So we'll create a div with a class of left, because these are the nav links we want to go on the left. We'll also create a second div with a class of right. And we'll end that div. Now let's just take a moment to think about what's going to happen when we refresh the page. Well, all of those nav links were appearing side by side, and that's because spans are by default an inline element. We've now placed them inside two different divs, and we know that divs are block elements. So now we're expecting those nav links we want to appear on the right are actually going to be on a new line now, because they're inside a div, which is a block element. Let's refresh the page and see that. Now, the reason why we set them inside a div is because we want to set the width on the div. In fact, we want each div to take up 50% of the horizontal space on our navbar. So that's fairly easy to style. We can just say div and say width 50%. And if we were to right click on this now and inspect, if we hover over those divs, we can see they take up 50% of the width. That's div number one. Let's come down to our div with the class of right. You can see both of them take up 50%. The only problem is they're not next to each other. That's the next step. We want them to appear next to each other. And because they're block level elements, they're appearing beneath each other. So we can actually change the display type on this div. So if we set them to display inline block, that will cause them to appear next to each other, but we still get that 50% width. Now you see, it doesn't quite work out like that. And that's because when they're both taking up 50%, there's still not quite enough room for them to fit on the width of the viewport here. So what we need to do is a little trick. And this is why it's a challenge, by the way. Set that to 49%. And if we inspect those two divs in the DevTools, we can see our first div taking up 50% of the viewport. And if we check out our second div, that takes up the other 50% of the viewport. But the key concept here is those two divs are now appearing side by side. We've got one set of nav links on the left and a second set of nav links on the right. Now, this is not quite what was intended, because if we look at those second set of nav links, yes, they're on the right, but they are to the far left of the right half of the page, whereas what we actually want them is to be on the far right of the right-hand side of the page. Now let's just think about that right-hand div, and we have span elements inside that div. So we have inline elements inside an inline block element. Now when we have inline elements, and very often we're thinking about text when we're thinking about inline elements, we can control the layout of inline elements using the text align property. Remember how if we just have something like a paragraph, we're able to set the text to the left, the text to the center, text to the right using text align. Well, we could also do that with a group of span elements because they're inline elements. So for example, if I style class, which only applies to that right-hand div, and we say text align property right, those spans are now going to jump to the right. And of course, the name of the class is not class, it's right. So let's try that again. And that's pretty much the hardest part of the challenge out of the way. The rest just depends how far you want to take this to make it look like a nav, because although we have the layout correct, it doesn't really look very much like a nav. So let's just style a few basic additional elements so we're left with something that actually looks like a navbar. Now the first thing we notice is that all of those nav links are probably a bit too close together. So if we have a look, the nav links are all inside spans, and we're not really using span for anything else on the page. So we can style the span directly. Since in a real context, we might be using span in different places on the page, we'd actually add a class to this span element. So we'd add a class of nav link and then style that. So it only impacted the appropriate elements on the page. But seeing as we're not going to add anything else to the page, we'll just style the span directly, and this is going to be those nav links. So we know that since they're inline, we can't set the width of them, but we can control the margin and the padding. So let's set padding on the element, and we know if we use a two-value system, we can style the vertical padding followed by the horizontal padding. I don't think we need too much vertical padding. Let's set it to 5 pixels. But we do want quite a bit of horizontal padding. So let's set that to 15 pixels. And we'll see those elements automatically start to spread out. And we can't see the outline of the element because they don't have a color, but we can of course use the dev tools for that. So if I hover my cursor over some of these spans, we can see the contents of the element. We can also see that the content is surrounded by a purple box, which is in fact our padding. If I span over the shop element, we see the same thing. We see the contents in light blue there, and we see the padding in the purple box surrounding the contents. Now, another thing we might do just to indicate very clearly to the user that this is a navbar is we might set a border bottom property. Another thing we might do is simply set a background color. For example, if I set nav background color light gray, now, unfortunately, it doesn't look great, and that's because there's a margin on the body. So if we just set the margin on the body to 0 pixels, that looks a bit more like a nav. It just looks too thin in terms of the height. So we can actually set a height property on the navbar itself. Let's set it to 40 pixels as a test. So obviously that looks better, but ideally we would have that font center aligned on the nav itself. So obviously that text is towards the top of the navbar. We want it vertically centered. Now we know that those nav links are inside the div. So we could, keeping in mind that the height of the navbar is 40 pixels, we could set a margin top on the div. For example, if we set that to 10 pixels, so it shifts all the text downwards. So now it's more or less centered. We can, of course, use a technique we looked at in the previous video as well, which is we could set a margin auto on the div. We could then go to the parent container, which is the nav, and set a display of flex. And that's going to automatically vertically center our nav links. But we also did say that we weren't going to use display flex for this at any point. So let's get rid of display flex and let's set margin auto to margin top 10 pixels. Now this is just one way of doing it. We don't actually need the background color. For example, if we didn't have this background color, well, how do we know that it is a nav? We could simply set a border bottom solid 1 pixel black. And that looks very much like a nav. Now there's a couple of extra features it needs so the user knows it's a nav. For example, when I hover my cursor over the nav links, hopefully one property and value we've annexed into our brains at this stage is the cursor pointer property and value. So if I set cursor pointer, now when we hover our cursor over those nav links, the user knows that this is something that can be clicked on. The other thing we can do to help the user understand that on a subconscious level, even more so, is by making use of a pseudo class hover on those span elements. So if we style span hover, and we can basically change the background color anytime the user hovers over those nav links. So we've set span hover background color gray. So now when the user hovers their cursor, the user understands even more that this is a dynamic part of the page that can be clicked on. Probably looks a bit better with light gray. And of course, one of the things as well that we'll find with the font on a navbar is it should be larger than the font on the rest of the page, ideally, and it's not at the moment, it's fairly small. So if we just go to the span and we can set the font size to 25 pixels, let's have a look at that. Now, of course, that's kind of messed up the center line a little bit. We might not even need this margin top value now. We probably do need some margin top, but just not 10 pixels. Again, we could solve this using display flex, but we're not going to do that right now. So this is pretty much the challenge. Congratulations if you made it this far without using display flex or display grid. You've shown a really good understanding of how CSS can be used. And especially you've shown a good understanding of the difference between block elements, inline elements, and inline block elements. Now let's take a quick look at why most developers are going to be using flex to solve this problem. So just take a look at all of this code that we've written. We are going to delete this code. We are going to reset back to the beginning here. The only thing we're going to leave in place are these two divs surrounding the nav links, which are span elements. So firstly, we're going to style our nav, and we're going to give this a display of flex. So let's just refresh the page. So what we should notice straight away is that our divs are now appearing side by side. So normally, of course, they wouldn't do that. They would normally take up the entire line, but it's because they are now inside a container with an inner display type of flex. The next thing we can do is style that right div. And we're simply going to say margin left auto. See what happens. And that's pretty much it. We can add the rest of the stylings that we looked at. We can increase the size of the font. We can set cursor pointer. We can set some margins and paddings. But we pretty much used 2 lines of CSS to create this setup. So we can get a glimpse into the power of CSS Flexbox, which we're looking at a bit later in the course. So this is probably the best solution for achieving this. But congratulations if you found the harder, more challenging solution where we don't make use of display flex. Well, thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the challenge. Catch you in the next part of the course.